So welcome to our first episode of the Gradient MSP podcast, the Fuchsia Firewall. My name is Matt Topper. I usually just go by Topper. I don't think anyone ever calls me Matt. And we're here with our first guest, Ashley Cooper. And for those of you who don't know Ashley, can you give some background and tell us about what you do at Gradient?
Yeah, so my name is Ashley Cooper. I'm the director of partner experience operations at Gradient, and so my role is kind of all around all the little things that touch the customers, operationally, systematically, even in human approach, right? Like trying to figure out how all of those touches kind of focus on making sure that the systems and tools that we use to support our customers are in line with the relevant initiatives and requirements that we have, and that the customer journey is being considered end to end, and we all have what we need internally to support that. So I kind of talk with like almost every single team, and I've kind of been doing that for quite a few years actually. Previously, before working at Gradient, I was at Avic, so I'm right at home with Fuchsia and firewalls if we
You're ready
need
to
to go
go.
there. But yeah, I was doing almost the same thing there, and before that I was a consultant for MSPs, and then before that I was at an MSP. So I've been around this industry a little bit.
So you run the whole gamut, and you're super active in the community. Probably a
Yeah.
lot of our watchers know who you are already.
Yeah, community is a big thing for, I mean, any company, but like as I understand it too, it's like just building that advocacy is like so vital, and being where they are and building their trust and having things like this to talk through and establish those vessels is great.
Awesome, thank you. My name is Matt Topper. I am the Director of Security here at Gradient MSP, and really that's involved in all aspects, right? Our internal security, our product security, and really being an advocate for Gradient MSP out in the community in terms of security practices and trying to give back. Before Gradient, I spent about 12 years at an MSP that went through a couple of M&As, so I've been at both small and large environments, and worked on both client things and internal information security and internal IT, kind of just run the gamut. I'm also relatively active in the community, but keep a way lower profile than Ashley. Probably some of you have talked to me already and don't even know it. All right.
Yeah, you're a low key. I don't know if you'll want to bring any of this in, but
Do it. Yeah.
you're kind of like low key super involved though, eh? You started the RMSP subreddit, didn't you?
Yeah, that's my claim to fame. I started our MSP. I was on
Yeah.
Reddit one day, saw that there wasn't one, and decided to make a subreddit for
Yeah.
just talking about MSP stuff. And other than that, just kind of keep a low public profile. But I'm out there.
So we're two sides of that coin then, eh? You're like the oldest RMSP moderator, and I'm the newest RMSP moderator.
You got it, exactly. So Ashley and I just went to and came back from IT Nation Secure, the security conference down in Orlando. And one nice thing about that was this was the first time her and I had ever actually met. We've been working together for, 4 months or so, ever since I started at Gradient. We've had plenty of phone calls, and was nice to meet in person. Was awesome to just talk to people and meet people in the security community around MSPs. Ashley, what did you see in your conversations? What did you see people talking about? What were people asking about? Anything that really big comes to mind from that?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, the first thing that I was kind of amazed by was that it totally not to do with anything this podcast related, but how much ConnectWise can make their events look so similar to themselves regardless of where they host them. So,
Right.
like the solutions pavilions and the way that things come in and being able to see the vendors. And honestly, I would say that that's probably the neatest thing when I was at Secure. I was actually there on behalf of MSP Geek. And so I was an attendee, and I don't usually get to be an attendee at events since I was been in vendor land. But it was really interesting to kind of walk around and see some of those vendors, and they've done an interesting job of like scoping out like who in the industry is focused on security and who is focused on the right aspects of security. And so they were selective with the vendors that they brought in, which is really good, because I think that a lot of the people at that event, whether they know it or not, there's a lot that still needs to kind of be learned and shift in our industry. Like, so many MSPs are still kind of seeing security as something that they need to just be compliant, right? And so, like, I mean, Jason Slagle actually had a really good talk about it that I went to, and he was talking about how, you know, using that as like a crutch for like solving your compliancy is like not really going to get you anywhere, and it's actually really dangerous too, because there are vendors out there that are going to be like, yeah, I can solve this for you, and so then you check that off in your little test, and you're like, yep, but then you might end up running into a problem. And so it's like, what I liked a lot about that event was that it was education based, and while recognizing that not everybody has all those insights, that they should, and we have a lot of learning to do, and we're going to need stuff like this to be able to support that.
I think you said it perfectly. That event felt focused. There wasn't a lot of fluff. There wasn't a lot of vendors that didn't make sense to be there or that weren't security focused. It was very dense and in a good way. Very good content, very good vendors, and it was just awesome to be able to have everyone talking about and thinking about that same aspect. You did mention one super important point, I think, right? The differentiation between security and compliance, and not really using compliance as like, this is all you have to do. That being said, though, I do really, really sometimes like to use the compliance hammer to get things resolved or set up that we might have user acceptance issues on. Sometimes it can be very powerful to just say, this is just what we have to do, and it avoids the argument.
Yeah, and it's like I guess there's like a difference between, like recognizing that it's a tool that you can use to have more influential conversations with your clients and to motivate them more intrinsically, but also not to like build your own house internally that way, right? And so what positioning you might bring outwards shouldn't be like necessarily, like, you shouldn't be believing in the back of your head that that's the only reason why you're doing it. And I think that some people still do. So that's where like the learning that we can all kind of grab from these things is more about security is not a offering that you sell. It's not like a thing that certain types of companies think about or is only an MSSP thing. It's ingrained into everything of our lives. It's ingrained into your personal life as a consumer. It's ingrained into your business and the people that you do businesses with. So, yeah.
Right. Well, one way I like to describe it, or I've heard it described on some CERT exams, is to remember that compliance is really just another risk, right? It's from an operational perspective. You are deciding as a business that it's important to maintain this compliance because either your customers are asking for it, or you've decided that you want to have it for marketing purposes or for security purposes. But really, like everything in security, it comes down to risk assessment. And as part of your internal risk assessment, you decided one of the things we have to do is maintain our SOC 2 or whatever other certification you're going for, right? If you're doing healthcare, HIPAA, et cetera. And when you're thinking about that, you don't necessarily go down the checklist of items that the framework says you have to do and do that. You decide, okay, as part of our overall security goal, we're also going to do the things listed in this regulation. And right, sometimes you have to, right? If you take credit cards, you have to do PCI or have to do HIPAA if you're in healthcare. But unless you're a government contractor, you don't have to do NIST CSF or some of the other federal ones, at least in the U.S. But just part of your best practices and your risk assessments, you decide this is something we want to focus on, and it's so hugely important to make that distinction. We in my MSP days, I saw all the time, we'd have a client coming up that says we have to be compliant with XYZ regulation, and it's like, okay, you do, but what are you actually trying to accomplish? And sometimes,
Yeah.
and the reality is, sometimes the answer is just we're trying to not get fined, and that's a legitimate thing too.
Yeah, and that's interesting too because like not to open a whole different can of worms, but like on the insurance side of things, right? Like we're seeing a lot more coming up around, um, like they're saying that like in the future it might be mandated that an
Mm-hmm.
MSP has cybersecurity insurance in place for their clients, and they might be considered like at fault if they don't in a situation like that. And so it's interesting because it's like, as an MSP, I can understand why so many of them are like, let's just quit our jobs and become goat farmers. There's like a lot going on, and so it's like, how do you kind of like isolate those important things that like here's what you start with, and here's like where like I know I'm going the right path and I'm picking the like I think it was like something like over I don't even remember the number. It was an absorbent amount of like different types of like standards that you could like adhere to.
Yeah, there's tons of it. Insurance was a pretty hot topic. That was something that I had multiple conversations about, and I think that's one of those topics that you're better able to help your customers when you can really start to talk to them at a business level. And the phrase that I always like to use in this, you move up the stack, right? You start talking about um, more high level business objectives and what you're trying to get done as an organization rather than the business owner kind of looking at you saying, okay, what do I absolutely need to do? Flip the conversation around and start with what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to protect and prevent happening? And in a lot of cases, your client or your customer won't necessarily know the answer to that question, and your job as the trusted advisor role is to help them answer that.
Absolutely. And that's interesting that you say that too, because like that's where you can kind of end up seeing that like intuitive connection, because like you wouldn't assume that like just any generic tool out there, like a customer success software or like a QBR management, like think about like a lifecycle insights, for example. Like like when they're building out their stuff, they're going to have to be considering like how what types of conversations during our QBRs or during our customers' QBRs, like where can we help from the vendor side drive those conversations more relevantly for the MSP, and like maybe use some of our knowledge from talking to all these people to support that. And so like I think that one of the things that we really need is that open dialogue, and having a podcast like this where you can get those people on the phone and you can speak to those other vendors, and like how can we help better the MSPs who maybe don't know how to have those conversations with their customers, and figure out like the relevant way to point to them and say like these are things that you need to be thinking about, if they're maybe not mature enough or haven't gotten to that step in their processing yet to like figure that out themselves.
Yeah, exactly, right. How can we start having conversations that go beyond the typical QBR of, okay, here's everything I offer. Are you on all this stuff yet? It's kind of your job to be helping your clients think about, do you actually need to be on this, and what's the risk you're protecting against by implementing this security tool? We all offer tons and tons of things, and some of it is relevant, some of it is not for every client.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where I know that there's some, I won't say disagreements, but just different philosophies across different how different organizations are run. Because I know that there's also a big need for standardization across your client base, but standardization doesn't necessarily mean that every single offering that you have has to be everywhere.
Right. Yeah, and that's interesting too because on the hand of like it doesn't need to be like not everything needs to be everywhere. There's also like the flip side of how do you get people to adopt further some of the tools that could help them in more places, but their internal silos or their structures or procedures that are in place might stop them from even identifying those opportunities or having those conversations. So like how in a security posture can you enable more open dialogue to either identify that this tool that we're using isn't the right, or identify those opportunities for where we can like leverage something that maybe has a different use case that can help us drive more awareness internally as well.
Yeah, it's a couple things. You can be talking about what type of environment you have, what size, and really what maturity level whoever you're talking to is. One of the things that I liked to do was to have, for every category of tool we had two things whenever possible. We had our standard item that was part of our standard solution in most cases, and then a second one that was, if the primary solution doesn't fit, our engineers were trained on it and knew how to support it, and it wasn't a total mystery, right? And not everything will be like that.
Mm-hmm.
There are some categories where you're not going to support two totally separate RMMs as an MSP, most likely, unless you're very large. But if you have an EDR solution, for example, maybe you have another uh, product that you support in addition to your primary one, in case there's some insurmountable compatibility issue with applications or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're not just coming out of nowhere with, hey, we have this one client with something different. How do we support them? That doesn't work out well for
Yeah.
anyone.
So how do you identify those like requirements or that threshold then, I guess, to say like it's like a persona experiment to be like this type of customer has this type of an environment, and we know just from our experience that like this and this works really well for this, but this doesn't work for that. So like do you kind of have all of that worked out up front and then give them the option and say it's almost like a silver and a gold, or like that could be a situation, or it's like a, oh, this won't work for you because, so you have to have this maybe more expensive thing, or like at what point do you make those kinds of calls and decisions and discussions?
So I think you totally nailed it with the word experience, right? Your customers and your clients are with you because they trust your experience and wisdom. So if you have seen a particular tool not work in a type of environment, right? Like say someone has gone completely cloud, or the flip side is 0% cloud and it's just a traditional on-prem environment, they might have different needs or different tools that'll work there. And you as the advisor can come in and say, I've seen this work this way before in this type of environment, and or even to the point of this thing that you're asking for, client, uh, let me tell you the ways that this is going to be a challenge in this type of environment and suggest something else. And really that type of wisdom is the value that you're bringing. Anyone can say, here's a tool to use, here's a category of tool to use. Those caveats or recommendations of different ways of doing things are one of the huge benefits we can bring from our experience at other customers, right? We always talk about kind of treat each client like they're your only client, which is kind of true, except when you're talking about wisdom and experience, then you want to remember that you have lots of other clients.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that I don't think I really was at the point where we were, and maybe it was happening and I just wasn't like involved in it, but I think that we, at my old MSP, we had, it was almost like we had like our owner operator type of situation, but like we didn't necessarily have like anybody dedicated to like that process of like sitting down and having those strategic future thinking conversations. And I think that's probably because as we've matured and as MSPs have matured, we're starting to realize that that trusted partner is becoming way more than just, hey, here's what we have to offer and you need it because of X, Y, or Z, but rather like making those, like, helping them make those decisions and being like, I've seen this, and like having that ongoing relationship. But where does the like, how do you build that security trust, or how do you build that, like, if they don't intrinsically understand the value of this thing that you're putting in front of them and you're saying, you could have this or not have this, and it won't be an issue until you get compromised, which might never happen, but it's going to cost you like $1,000 a month. And so, like, how do you have, like, without obviously that mandate in place to say you have to, what sorts of things can you bring to the table to like justify and explain that sort of thing?
So one of the things that I like to do in these conversations is really not feel like I'm trying to push a particular product or solution and really look at it from a risk-based perspective, right? So help the client understand and do what I would call a mini risk analysis right on the spot, right? Talk about impact and likelihood and let the client understand or let the client make that decision of, there's an estimate, right? 50% chance of this happening in the next year. If that happens, it's going to cost me X dollars. Do I want to spend Y dollars to mitigate that, or do I not want to spend that and just accept the risk of that happening? And really, I don't like selling things with scare tactics or you're going to get hacked or any of that stuff is going to happen because they hear that all the time from everyone. And treating your clients and customers like adults and letting them make the decision of here's everything laid out. We can help you make the decision, but ultimately you have to make that choice. That
Yeah.
has gone over well.
Yeah. So what about risk? Like, how do you like? What if like? Do you just say like, you're too much risk. I'm firing you. How do you deal with those people who are just like won't get that and they're like I don't care.
Well, it's a really good question, right? We did not fire many clients. Some we probably should have. Um, but as far as helping make that informed decision, there are some things that you can't bend on. And what I mean by that is if you're working with an organization that absolutely refuses to do MFA in 365, for example, you might have an internal policy that's just too far off the risk scale for you. Um, but if you have someone who doesn't have a different security layer that you think is more of a nice to have layer, then maybe that's okay. And really what I'm saying there is not necessarily to copy what I or we did, but to say there is a point in your own internal as the MSP risk tolerance and risk appetite that a client is either too far or okay. You need to decide for yourself where that cutoff is. And that goes even for accepted risk, right? There are some cases where if a customer says, I don't want MFA on 365 and I accept the risk, that's still not going to be okay. Um, there are some organizations that might be okay with saying that. I don't really think so at this point, but um, it, you as the service provider need to think about where your cutoff is, and it just goes back to standard risk terminology, right? That
Mm.
we're literally describing the concept of risk appetite there, and you need to decide for yourself what is your risk appetite as the MSP, both for your internal environment and on behalf of your customers. All easier said than done sometimes, but the
Yeah.
reality of it, that really is what you're doing, even if you don't sit down on a piece of paper and say this is what my risk appetite is. You're kind of behaving and acting that way anyway. It's just not formalized and no one ever wrote it down.
Yeah. So how do you figure this out? Like, how do you like obviously there's resources like Secure, which we just went to, and there's books, and I think I actually have. Oh yeah, it's right here. Oh, oh, so like there's like Jennifer Bleem wrote this like simplified cybersecurity sales for MSPs, and I was taking a peek at this, and I thought that there was some really interesting points in here too. But what it like as an MSP, like how do you figure this stuff out?
It's a really good question. I've never read that particular book, so I'm pretty self-taught, and that's in two ways. One is when I came in, I was fortunate enough to have people to learn from who had been in corporate environments that talked about real formal risk analysis and um, kind of instilled the principles of make sure to do this when talking to your customers, Matt. Books are I've always been a book learner, but the thing is, like, especially on some of those certification type books, right? I've read tons of them, and you can end up in this kind of theoretical ivory tower land
Mm-hmm.
if you do that. You know, like if I were to take some of the things in like the CISM is very risk focused, and if I were to take all of the things in there and try to apply that to an MSP sales meeting, we'd be there for 3 hours, and the client would be probably very impressed with the diligence and not actually buy anything because we just bore them to death. Um, it's one of those things I think that experience is the best teacher, which I know is tough in that it kind of necessarily means you have to have some failures along the way. But I've never found a better way to get good at or learn this kind of thing except either through experience or osmosis from talking to someone who's been there before. And you know, we're talking about risk, which really just is like the central theme. It could be like the little tagline for this podcast because it's all about security. It's really all about risk. You know, if you take the concept of just framing discussions in risk-based terms, you'll be so far ahead with your customers. And you know, if you talk about right the example we were using before of MFA on Microsoft services, if you paint the risk picture for the customer like that, it really becomes a no-brainer not to, right? The cost is essentially zero if you just use the built-in Microsoft. The impact is super high in the form of a business email compromise, and the likelihood is pretty high as well. So as far as a return on investment for doing that from the customer's perspective, you would do that 10 times out of 10.
Yeah. Trying to think about what else. I was like, I'm kind of interviewing you at this point. I'm like, hey, tell me more about
Right?
this.
We totally flipped it, but that's okay.
Yeah. Do you want to interview? um, yeah, I was just, I get so excited about learning and like whenever there's an opportunity to like consume information that somebody in our industry who's an expert has, I'm all about it, right? So like I'm probably like buying all like I had the Bob Koppich's book. I've bought all of those, and like when I saw this book, I was like, I need to buy this. I think she'll probably be a good person to like get on this podcast, maybe
Yeah,
even.
kind of want to read that.
Yeah, I'll buy it for you. Send it to you. Happy launch of your podcast day.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to kind of add on something that you said afterwards, so I'm just going to be silent for a second while I think about that. But if you want to say anything else, you should go for it.
You know, one of the challenges or things that I don't know how to do is to give someone a step-by-step guide of how to sell and position cybersecurity. And I think the conclusion I've come to in thinking about that is there is no step-by-step or checklist. It's really understanding the security ecosystem, the security environment, what tools are out there, and then helping your clients make informed decisions about what they need and what risks they have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like there was like the one chapter that I was poking on. Actually, sorry, 1 second. I'm gonna start that over again, but I just want to make sure that I was like not lying before I start to say something. Okay, yeah. So it was like yeah. So like the one thing that I was like looking at in there is interesting because it's not just cybersecurity. It's kind of just across the board, and I've noticed it in a lot of scenarios. But it's about like that gap selling, right? And it's about how do you highlight and surface those those gaps and without like what you were talking about, obviously, like right, bringing forth that risk, but without sounding like you're just like your own little ticking doomsday clock. Like if you don't do this, if you don't do this, so it's like like that those scare tactics that so many people end up falling into, um, because they work, right? Like people
Yeah.
don't want to be falling victim to this other thing, but how can we lead that through a conscious awareness of what could happen without kind of falling into that?
So I think You answered the question when asking it unintentionally, and that is to emphasize that whatever you're describing or whatever scenario is something that could happen. And the pitfall I see some of these scare tactics go into is something like, if you don't buy this, you are definitely going to get compromised or going to get breached. And maybe that's true. Maybe it just means that the likelihood is something like 9 out of 10. But the way to garner that trust is to make sure that you're honest with your clients in your discussions about these, and don't come across as that if you don't buy this thing, your business is going to go under, and oh, here's that stat about half the businesses that get compromised never come back, and all that stuff. And really talk about, if you have this product or have this service, the likelihood of this goes down. It doesn't go away, and it's not 100% if you don't have it. You're just changing the likelihood. And you can literally go in and do the basic risk equation right in the right in the meeting, right? So impact and likelihood, say, okay, we can reduce the impact by doing these, or we can reduce the likelihood, and talk about where you want to be on that continuum based on how much money you want to spend, and really
Yeah.
have like a, help them make the decision. It is one of the things that I like to talk about. You're not making decisions for your customers. You're helping them have the information that they need to make the decision for themselves.
Yeah, that's true. I find it so much of a struggle right now, especially because like we're kind of in this catalyst moment of where the people who are getting it are really getting it, and the people who aren't are still kind of seeing it as this afterthought or this thing that like doesn't apply to them because they're not in whatever industry cares about it the most at this moment. But like it's hard to balance that when you see, you're still seeing vendors or like software providers out there that are like charging or putting like security features behind an additional like extra tier, right? And so like, like, oh, don't you don't get SSO unless you're on our
Yeah.
professional or something, right? And so it's like, how can you intrinsically motivate security while still having to deal with like realities like that?
It's tough. Right, the SSO tax is extremely frustrating all across the industry. It's a great example. Um, Without trying to sound like a broken record, it really does kind of fall back into that you're accepting the risk of not having SSO for an application. Right, right. So let's say you have a vendor that you really want to use, like an ERP system for your business. You really want to use them, and you need everything in their business plan plus SSO, which is only in the enterprise plan. There's a couple things you could do there. You could buy enterprise. You could have a decision and a discussion that says we are going to accept the risk of not having SSO because we don't feel that the spend for enterprise is worth it. You could also ask for it
Yeah.
to be like a line item inclusion in business. Some vendors will do that. Not too many, but it's worth asking for in all cases.
Mm,
The thing you can't do, or I guess you can, but it's not a proper risk response, is nothing, right? So that's called risk rejection, and just kind of pretending it's not there. And if you as an organization say we are going to accept whatever risk that might be here, and write down that you're doing that, then that's a completely acceptable response. That's one of the things you can do from your security posture. What it's up to you as the advisor to do is talk about one of the things that your software needs when you're making the requirements list is to have SSO and have security features. And that goes back to that up the stack conversation, right? Your job is to get involved with your customer during the software selection process, right? If you're getting the phone call from someone that says, hey, we just bought XYZ ERP system, help us set it up, you're way too late to the game to have a meaningful impact on security posture. And the challenge is to make sure that you're conversing with your customers regularly enough to get involved earlier and build up that trust that they can say, we're thinking about switching ERP systems, can you help us pick one?
mm. I think I don't. I feel like maybe I'm living in a fantasy world in some situations, but I really do feel like as vendors, or like just in general, like we can't expect MSPs to like intrinsically and like honestly like understand and be involved in these things if as the software vendors ourselves we are not also doing that, right? And so I think that there's a lot of people who will be like, oh, a security topic, I can talk about that, but like we're still seeing like SSO behind
Right,
paywalls. And
right.
so it's like I believe, and maybe this is like an unpopular opinion, and don't come at me, vendors that do this, but I believe that it's our responsibility to lead by example and get rid of that norm of, hey, I'm going to charge for your safety. And it's like, this is a everybody problem and it's an everybody thing. And I don't know. I get a little bit, when I see that, I'm like, I don't even know if I want to do business with you because do you even think about security properly at that point, right? So, I
Yeah,
don't
it's
know.
totally fair. I mean, I know from the vendor side of this, one of the issues or problems or reasons for that is there are a lot of organizations out there that don't know how to set up SAML properly, and it becomes a big support burden. Um, that being said, it's one of those things that in a truly ideal world, it would mean, okay, market, if you're interested in security and interested in those features, stop buying the stuff that does that, and the message will get sent.
Or here's a consultant that we work with. Go talk to them. They'll give you 1 hour free to talk about what this looks like, and if you need their help, um, perfect way to build advocacy in the industry, right? So if you're a vendor who doesn't understand, or if I guess if you're like an MSP who doesn't understand how to properly set up like SAML or any kind of single sign-on in your industry, like or you don't know how to like properly do identity provider
Mm-hmm.
stuff, I'm sure that there's like other vendors or other communities are like MSP Geek even like
Yeah.
there's places, right? Like I don't know. I think that we should be expecting a little bit more on that front in order for us to all level up. Um, I'm not really sure how it's going to happen though. It'll be interesting to see over the next few years for sure.
No, it really is interesting, and I guess the question becomes, without being like dismissive or snarky about it, like if I'm a vendor, one of the things that is going through, look, customer, if you're not taking your own security seriously, why should I do it? So really everyone is involved, right? So from the vendor side, it's we're looking to have security features built. Like perfect example is there was a time when MFA was an extra charge for almost everything, and now that's like standard on most things, right? At least TOTP kind of codes, even if
Well, I
not
think hopefully they
SSO.
just realized that it was just easier. Like, oh, I don't have to build in my own like gateway. I just like connect them to what they already use. Perfect.
Right, right. And so you have to figure that is starting to come with
Mm-hmm.
SSO as well, and other things. And so I guess overall I'd say it's a dual responsibility, right? Vendors need to be raising the security awareness, and during sales calls think about, are you thinking about security, customer, or are you just buying this? And customers and MSPs are need to be spending time asking those questions during the sales process. And of course, like I mentioned before, the challenge for the MSP is to get themselves involved early enough to influence that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Education wise too, like building out that content and like thinking about like, hey, this isn't something I sell or this isn't something that's directly related to what I do, but like how can I like enable MSPs at thinking as a vendor again? How can I enable MSPs to like understand this posture and what it means and where to go for assistance and how to leverage our tools, right? And I think that we end up getting that, and I touched on that a little bit, where it's like, oh, I'm not a security vendor. And it's like, well,
You kind of are, right? Like every
Everybody,
product,
yeah,
yeah, there's
exactly.
security aspects in everything.
Yeah.
You're it's like saying I'm not a software vendor. I don't know.
I
It's
don't sell software, I sell an experience.
oh man.
Yeah, that's funny. Cool.
Let's see. I think we've beaten that topic to death.
I know, I just keep like rambling when I don't know what to say.
No,
Sorry.
all good. So we had one or two other things. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly, just because it was in the news, was the Hertzbleed vulnerability, and this one I have very opinionated on this. One is the trend of these major vulns, or quote unquote major vulns, having websites and themes and logos is just really kind of infuriating to me. You know, this comes off as another vuln that tried to capitalize on the infamy of Heartbleed and kind of caused a panic when it first came out.
Hmm.
Right, Heartbleed was one of those once every couple year kind of vulns where you had to drop everything and patch now if you were using that software. Um, this is not like that, and this trend of this kind of boy who cried wolf trend on every single vuln that comes out is frustrating for me in the security world, because now I have customers or clients saying, is this something we have to worry about? What should we do? Are you guys patched for this? Et cetera. And the reality of it is the impact of Hertzbleed isn't even fully known yet. It's still largely an academic theoretical type of
Hmm.
issue. And all of a sudden, if you're an MSP, you probably have somebody who saw it on, Bleeping Computer, or, even mainstream news sites, and said, what do we have to do? And the answer is nothing yet. Um,
Hmm.
so that's a little, maybe even not little. That's a major pet peeve of mine. In that the once every couple years major event like Log4j, or when there was the Hafnium issue on the Exchange servers and that kind of thing, that should be a relatively rare thing. And all of a sudden, there's every vuln has elevated to that category, and it means that when the real ones come around, that your clients are less likely to take you seriously as an MSP if you start talking about it when, oh, another big vuln came out.
Yeah. And I mean, I haven't seen the website. That's wild that I didn't know that was like they're acting like they're their own their own little companies, I guess, in that case. That's true. I know like I know that it is difficult to kind of sift through the weeds a little bit in there, just because my own experience is from at Avik. I was like, okay, well, I know that somebody has this type of device on their network, right? Like that's something that I can identify, but I wanted to try and figure out a way, like, okay, well, there's vulnerabilities that are coming out, like like the that clock thing that Cisco had a while ago. Like Avik was able to identify that and like identify the customers that had it, and it's a big win. And so, kind of like to the point of like, oh, well, just because you're not a security vendor doesn't mean that you can't support the security posture.
Right.
We ended up rolling out this vulnerability disclosure kind of process internally, where if somebody identified something that was happening, we would put it into our Slack channel, and then if there was like one of our eng people could take a look at it quickly and be like, oh yeah, like these types of devices like do exist in our network, we could then like proactively reach out to those people and say, hey, we noticed that this device is impacted, whatever, like go in, here's the remediation steps, go and do this. But then there's kind of like that level of like, we ended up having to put some thresholds on it, because, well, we shouldn't be just letting them know out of panic if there's nothing that can be done, right? So like we kind of had to build some criteria, like something that's over a 9 CVE, and something that is like has a documented fix in place or something, and so we could follow that process and be like, okay, like let's let them know. And it was really valuable. Like we got a lot of feedback saying like thank you so much. But yeah, it was difficult for me to kind of like sift through the weeds on some of that stuff. Like, is this something that like, and then all of a sudden you start to see them, then like your Google feed just starts filling up with
Right.
like all of these ZDNet articles or bleeping computer articles, and it's like, okay, well here's a vulnerability and here's a vulnerability and you get one and you get one, and it's like, okay, well I can't notify everybody about everything, but when there's like a big thing, right, like oh these micro ticks or this Fortinet thing, and so like I struggle not from the like trying to discern on the website side, but like from that same perspective of I want to be giving these MSPs relevant information that they can action and not just being another, oh, look how scary your network is, right? And
It's super awesome though that you were able to do that, right? And that's something hugely valuable. And I'm sure all of your customers found it really, really helpful to help them figure out, okay, um, this is something that we need to update. And thank you for letting us know. We weren't scheduled to patch the Cisco device for another couple months. We'll do it this month, versus
yeah,
everybody stop what you're doing and patch right now, which is
yeah,
what some of the responses have turned into for what feels like everything.
yeah,
Um, that type of guidance is one of the ways vendors and MSPs can help their customers, right? Help them to put real meaningful impact statements out. Is this something that, yes, it's a vuln, but you're fine if you get it on the next
yeah,
patch cycle, or is it a real 0 day type of emergency kind of
yeah.
thing? And those should be
Building that
pretty rare.
trust. Yeah. That's kind of like the reason like I promoted it. I was like, you know what, like this isn't something that like we sell, like this has nothing to do with our business other than we know that this type of device exists for you. And so it's that opportunity to build trust so that when like thinking about that as an MSP, even like they might not want to do anything about it, but it's like that heads up, it's like that reiteration for them, like, oh, you're thinking about us, you are aware of, you've got our back, right?
Yeah,
And that's that piece that is just like you kind of do that a couple times and they just intrinsically just start realizing that you've got their back and that they can trust you. And yeah,
yeah, yeah. To feel like when I was doing MSP work, it was awesome when I would get a real meaningful vulnerability announcement from a vendor that said, "Hey, we noticed this thing. You have to do 1, 2, and 3. Here's the patch for it. Awesome." What wasn't as nice was when I got the marketing type one that
oh
said,
yeah,
"Hey, your entire network's going to blow up if you don't buy this thing," and it became
mm-hmm.
hard to differentiate sometimes.
Yeah, people who take advantage versus like yeah, there's like that fine line sometimes where like you can take an opportunity for a positive experience and then go too far with it or go down the wrong path where it's like, oh, now this has become a monetized thing, and it's like that's not the intention. And as soon as you apply that requirement, it's like you almost might not as well do it, right?
Right? Yeah, you get your goodwill from saying just a little bit, and if you try to take it too far, you'll just immediately erase all of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's hard to measure those things too, and I think that's part of what's interesting. Maybe it's a topic for another time, but like measuring the sentiment that you can grow from those things, and how can you take security as a discipline and build off of it, but then also show the value that that's bringing to your business and your customers' businesses.
That would be an awesome topic.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
I feel like this event, this session was almost like a teaser for what topics could be in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I guess that's not surprising as episode 1 with no
Yep.
script.
There we go. We did it.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. So I'd like to thank Ashley for coming on. We talked about probably 5 or 10 different things that are going to end up as future topics and different podcast episodes with Ashley or other guests. Stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for watching.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was lots of fun.